session will be recorded, and the reason why is so that we can share this wonderful discussion with others who weren't able to join today. So without further ado, I will turn things over to
There, unmuting. We don't have that problem on the stage. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to see you all. Wonderful to feel for the first time since the 12th of March in a crowd. It's quite a peculiar situation to be someone whose work is entirely dependent upon not being socially distant, and to try to find the ways in which it's possible, necessary to connect in this world. And I think I'm very pleased to have been asked to come here by Daniela, particularly under the auspices of the Rattlestick Theater, whose purpose is to create community, either actually or virtually. And I had the, as a lot of you know, the great privilege of playing Elizabeth Seton in Cousy Cram's wonderful play called Novenas for a Lost Hospital, that dealt with a number of the earlier plagues that have been visited upon the city. Before I hand this over to Stephen, who knows real things, I'd like to read Elizabeth Seton's speech, but that Cousy put in the middle of the play, in the moment of despair, when it seemed not possible. The other thing that I've been thinking about so much is the way, and there's been a lot of talk about it today, particularly in the news, the way in which the difference between those of us who are privileged to be here, who can make this choice, who can stay home, it's another reminder of our privilege and another reminder of our responsibility to all the people who keep working. And I think the great theatrical event of every day, which is growing and growing and growing, are the people clapping for the workers, all the workers, at 7 o'clock. I hope it's happening in all your neighborhoods. It's been extraordinary to watch it grow day after day. And I had one other odd observation about connecting, because so many people are wearing masks now. And the thing that you discover as you're walking down the street, sparkling at everybody 6 feet away, is that no one can tell you're smiling when you have a mask on. And so it's very interesting to watch the different ways people have developed to connect. Some people talking, some people using their whole bodies. Dogs especially get that. Those are just some thoughts from the middle of this, of the great hunker that all of us are in one way or another engaged in, either hunkering or making hunkering possible for the others. And because it's a very difficult time for humanity, I'd like to read Elizabeth's speech from the middle of Novenas for a Lost Hospital. Remember, what was I thinking? You can't put something back together that isn't there anymore. So much left undone, so many hearts still closed. Where did all the caring go in this world, this modern world, this moment in time, this country, this state, this city, this neighborhood, this room of people? That person there, breathing in a chair. Do you know if your world imploded, exploded, upended, changed direction, and collided with poverty, fever, stigma, chaos? Would there be someone there for you to hold your hand in the darkness? Someone to help you let love and hope into your heart? Would there? I wanted to be that someone. Can you? Are you? Will you be that person? If not you, then who? Who is left? I think we're finding that there are many people who have decided to be that person. And now I'd like to hand it over to Stephen, who can help us understand the shape of this world that has come upon us in a month. Not even a month, the 12th of March for most of us.
Kathy, thank you. If I weren't so choked up because of your wonderful reading, I could proceed much more straightforwardly, but really I'm kind of choked up, and your reading was just so evocative. And let me just start by saying what a great honor it is to be in the same chat room with you. And don't know if you realize, but I first encountered you in your performance of Wit with my wife, Isabel Swift. And we were up close and just overwhelmed at that point. And it's just really incredible in my mind that we're now connected through this serendipity of the COVID pandemic. And it's possibly the only good thing in my mind that's come out of the pandemic. So thank you so much. And the second thanks in my mind is to Daniela, who, for everybody that knows her, is just our idol in terms of a pillar of the community. And it's not at all surprising that she has taken this bold and creative step to organize a salon where there was no salon before. And Daniela, thank you. And I hope this is one of many, because it's exactly what I think the community needs in this very desperate time. So let me try to explain kind of a scene set for what I'm trying to accomplish with you. And this is a great segment of the Rattlestick community and the New York City community. And time is kind of limited. And so, you know, what am I trying to accomplish in this very brief time? And it's basically not to reassure you, but to provide information that you may find reassuring to yourself. And what that is really is a kind of a framework to think about where we are now and where we're headed in the next few weeks. And it's a framework to kind of hang your own questions on, and also perhaps on how you're going to process the volumes and volumes of new information that you have access to, which no doubt you are pouring through daily. So the way I'd like to do this is to cover an opinion piece that I wrote that has been submitted to a major daily newspaper. And what I try to do there is put the whole kind of American perspective into play as to where are we in this pandemic and what should we do as a country. So bear with me, because what I'd like to do is just cover some of those highlights. The actual text is under embargo. It may or may not ever see the light of day, but it doesn't matter, because there are other ways of getting it out there, including this. So let me try to go through this op-ed, not verbatim, but by highlighting some of the key principles, and then try to focus it on what I think may be some of the issues that you're interested in for you and your family and your community. And let me start with just a single upfront caveat that I think is important for all of us to consider when we inform ourselves about the pandemic, which is, if this were a baseball game, the pandemic would be in the second inning. And so it's in the second inning for everybody, meaning we have about 10% of the information as a society that we are going to need to actually intelligently respond to the pandemic. So 10% doesn't mean that we shouldn't start, because we have to start. And we already, after 4 months, are here responding via city, state, federal strictures. But it's a caveat that I think all of us should think about going forward, because what do you think about in the second inning of a baseball game? Who's going to win? Well, I can reassure you that we, mankind, is going to win, because we're stronger. We're the better team. But I can't tell you what's going to happen in the 5th inning and the 7th inning. I can't tell you who's going to hit the home run and when, but I can tell you that we're going to win. Okay, so let me go on with the op-ed. And it starts by saying that we're all alarmed by today's news. You know, what do we hear every day, especially recently, is a desperate dash for scarce ventilators, conflicting recommendations on personal protection, frontline health workers being exhausted and demoralized, and a devastating toll in the country. We lead the world in deaths, and then New York City, as you well know, leads the country by way too much in our own human toll. So imagine your concerns broadly fit into 4 areas. One is, many have economic concerns, you know, job loss, just being removed from society and having significant financial impacts. Second would be severe lockdowns and its impact on your personal and social and family life. Third is anxiety about your very survival and those that are near and dear to you. And fourth is at a country level. You know, what's going on in the country? Do we have the right strategies? Do we have the right game plan? In terms of today's strategy that we're all familiar with, we're flattening the curve. And that means, in epidemiologic terms, that means incredible, stringent, indiscriminate suppression strategies. We don't know where the virus is, who has it and who doesn't. So the answer of New York State and New York City and of much of the country is essentially a lockdown. And meaning all of us pretty much voluntarily are restricted to the very 4 walls that we're seeing in the Zoom room. And this will allow us to have time to ramp up supply chains and you know, get the frontline medical workers all of the equipment that they need. As you know, there's a mad dash for ventilators. But what's going on in terms of national policy and trajectory is we're buying about 1 month of time for evolving a coherent national and state plan. So this 1 month of window where all of us are making huge personal sacrifices has an aggregate societal benefit, which is we're basically saving as many lives as possible and not having a surge that overwhelms our medical care system, and at the same time allows procurement and provisioning through the supply chain to make sure that various vital equipment is available. But so what happens after this month? what happens in May when the curve is flattened? And let me just say with high probability that the curve will be flattened. These stringent measures work. So the good news is that this is all being done for a very good reason, and it will work. But the question is, this 1 month is not an idle month when we sit around. I think we as a country, we as a state, we as a city need to figure out where the country is going next. So in that regard, I put on my thinking cap, and maybe a little bit megalomaniacal, but I pretend to tell the country what are 6 key areas that we have to focus on in the next month that will be put together in a comprehensive plan. Not the specifics, but what are these key pillars? So let me quickly go through these 6 pillars with you and then try to, again, amplify some of it for your own personal and family considerations. So the first thing that we need to do is to have a centralized federal and state and local response for the whole country. So look at this as our domestic D-Day. And I think we've seen in the last couple of days the Pearl Harbor analogy, and I'd like to migrate the Pearl Harbor analogy to a D-Day analogy, because what Pearl Harbor was, as I understand it, was a Japanese attack that was devastating because this country was totally unprepared. So that analogy is really good to this pandemic, because this country 3 months ago was totally unprepared. This was a Pearl Harbor. But what we're doing now, what we should do, and I'm confident that we will do, is turn Pearl Harbor into a D-Day. And a D-Day means you become proactive. You actually figure out what it takes to gather this incredible flotilla, incredible commitment of allied forces, not just one force, but many. And the analogy is that federal, state, and local governments need to have a well-aligned central strategy and plan. And if we don't get our act together, it's going to be the ongoing fragmented, unstructured, uncoordinated battle that is America, by the way. You know, so the US, in terms of our federalism and our various state level public health systems, was not structured to respond to the coronavirus. I think the founding fathers had a lot of other issues when they crafted this fair country besides the virus. But the virus, you know, really doesn't care. The virus is marching to its own tune in a very blind way. So we have to figure out how as a country we can respond to this blunt force that doesn't recognize any of the primary tenets of what makes this country tick. So that's the first pillar. Get our act together in a central and coordinated way, unlike we've ever done domestically, but very much like D-Day, which did in fact happen. Second is to keep society as functional as possible. And we all are living with and seeing the unavoidable economic, security, and societal and political impacts. So, you know, the market is cratered, but more fundamentally, a lot of the economy is going down very quickly. People are talking recession for sure, and possible depression. So we cannot address health considerations in isolation in formulating public policy. I think we have to figure out a very health-focused plan on how do we take maximum care of our population while at the same time not paralyzing society. And those are huge questions, but we have a lot of smart thinkers that can understand some of those trade-offs, and I think we need to address them in formulating a plan. The third pillar is testing. You've heard a lot about this country not being prepared with tests. You even hear about it today. We don't have nearly sufficient testing at all levels of our country, whether you suspect you might have the virus, whether you're actually sick with the virus. whether you may have had the virus and recovered. There are vastly inadequate numbers of tests available to determine your status. At the same time, as you read that countries like Taiwan, like Singapore, like China have abundant tests, and they're testing not only everybody who needs it, but much more to understand the general population distribution of the virus so that they can formulate coherent policy. So let me just give you a thought experiment that I think you should have in your mind as you read all this stuff about testing and its inadequacy. Let me just give you a conceptual framework of how I look at why we need testing. Let's just say you have 100 people that are the population at risk. Let's just take the Rattlestick theater audience at any point in time. And Daniela, I think OFF-BROADWAY is 99 seats. And so I don't know I don't know exactly how many Rattlestick has, but let's just say we're talking about a 100-seat Rattlestick theater. Okay, we need to know out of those 100 people in the theater, how many are infected? And if you take New York City right now, the best guess, my personal guess, is if we could actually apply the testing to the Rattlestick audience of 100, that about 50 of those might be infected right now. Okay, about 50. Of those 50, only half know that they've ever been infected. If you take Anthony Fauci's numbers that he talked about yesterday, we have, in the Rattlestick theater, we have about 50 that are infected with the virus. We have 25, roughly, that either are or were sick. We have about 10% of those that will require hospitalization. So, you know, maybe about 3 of those 100. And of those, maybe 10 or 20% will go to the ICU, and of those, a small fraction will die. So by my calculations, of the 100 people sitting in the Rattlestick theater right now, and of course we can't do that, about 0.3 will die. Now, I'm not saying that's good or desirable or acceptable or anything, but I just want you to kind of understand that if and when we start getting good data, this is somewhat what it might look like, and I think likely what it will look like. And it's very different than the worst case scenarios that I'll get to in a minute, which is what is driving the public fear, the private fear, the household fear. It's a very different set of assumptions and numbers. So let me go on to the fourth pillar, which is to protect high-risk populations. The least ambiguous part of this pandemic is that we know that there are vulnerable populations. And I think all of you have been super up on what that means and who they are. And a lot of it is us. And what makes for vulnerability is age plus underlying condition. And neither of these are totally fixed, but there's good indication of the relative weight of these factors in determining risk. So age alone contributes to the risk, but is not the major determinant of risk, at least not in everything I've seen, which is, I frankly would rather be an 80-year-old robust person without any underlying disease than a 50-year-old with bad lung disease. I think what we need to do is land on what constitutes high risk, which is some combination of age, but more significantly specific underlying diseases. And it's not just pre-existing conditions, the way that your insurance company thinks about that. It's essentially the way the virus thinks about things. The way a virus thinks about it is that this is a respiratory virus and it attacks the lungs. It never gets into the blood. It doesn't hit your pancreas or, you know, your bone marrow. It hits the lungs. So if you have any lung disease or heart disease that's actually connected to the way the lungs work, or things like diabetes, which cause general depression of immune status, or if you have cancer, or if you're immunosuppressed, you are at tremendously high risk. And it's a matter of life and death to be protected. So what do you do about that? Is you have quarantine, but you have fastidious, rigorous quarantine. But I think not only on a personal determination basis, I think in all the strategies that the country is considering, we need to look at this population, which is a valued part of society, and figure out how society will help protect them in addition to everything else that they're doing. So what do we do about the lower risk majority, which is 90% of the people are not going to be, quote, vulnerable? And what do we do about them? So I think they're going to have, as they are now, they're going to have very widespread infection, and they're going to be the base of the pyramid. You know, they're in a seasonal flu year, Americans die at the rate of about 50,000 a year, plus or minus 20,000. That's awful. It's tragic, but it's something that we've come to accept as a society as part of seasonal flu. My own notion is, at the end of the day, the non-vulnerable part of the population, which is 80% or more, is going to have a very, very bad seasonal flu experience, which is going to, you know, jam up the intensive care units. It's going to cause surge problems, but it's not the outright tragedy of these high-risk people. And the virus just seems to be really targeting these people that need a very different strategy. So moving on, the next pillar is understanding the lethality of the virus. So we've all seen the numbers. We've seen projections for mortality in New York City all the way from the high of 250,000 to perhaps 25,000 or less. That's a huge exponential degree of difference. We've seen in the US estimates ranging from 2 million plus to 100,000 mortality. So huge difference, not only in terms of who dies, but in terms of societal strategies. So where did these numbers come from? And why are they so different? And I think that's really critical to understand, and still a matter of huge debate. So countries like the UK have very prestigious institutions that do modeling for a living. The Imperial College, Oxford, they've all produced you know, various results based on mathematical models. In the US, we have the Institute of Health Metrics at the University of Washington. Similarly high numbers. They get fed into this administration. Other numbers get fed into the UK administration. And what they are typically are not science. They're mathematical models. People and administrations and policymakers don't understand that. And this is not a criticism of models. It's just a question of understanding the extent and limit of what they are. They are not science. They are based on assumptions. And the assumptions that one put in, which are well-intentioned and perhaps individually tested, that when you put in 5 or 10 assumptions into a computer, into a model, they're going to spit out all kinds of things. And the question is not to discourage that. The question is, how much is that going to actually drive what the country does? And Britain did a whole about face in their strategy because of one long report that was based on a model from the Imperial College. We had our president tell us numbers of presumed deaths over the next month that was based on some model that somebody gave to someone in the administration. So what should our forecasting be based on? And there's no denying, there's no controversy around, we need real world data. We need data about the triangle that I just told you. The triangle that I related to you, the numbers are hypothetical. They're my best guess based on 10% of the information. What we need to do as a society, as a political system, and as a bunch of smart scientists is populate the data banks that we need, where we have real world data from biology, from immunology, from clinical trials, and that will allow us to have real numbers. And my guess is what we're looking at are extreme worst case projections that are based on mathematical modeling, and the more specific real world information we get, you're going to see those projections go down and down and down. Will this ever become relatively innocuous or, you know, not a major issue? No, it's a huge issue. But the numbers are different by an order of magnitude, and we need to get much better data to figure that out. And finally, let me just go to the last pillar, number 6, which is the exit strategy. I think everybody's wondering, how will this end? And, you know, to me, it's not rocket science. I think if you understand the nature of pandemics and viruses, I think you could pretty much forecast how this will end. Not, you know, like a baseball game, you don't know whether it's going to go into extra innings. You know, you don't know how many relief pitchers you're going to need. You don't know if there's going to be a police curfew at 1 a.m. to send everybody home, but you do know that the game is going to end. So how is this going to end? One is, there are only 4 ways broadly. One is it's going to end with a vaccine that works, that gets shot into several billion arms. Okay, now that's going to take, people say 12 months. I'm going to say best case scenario, double that. But that's a possibility. Nobody knows the likelihood of success. I think it's not low, but it's also not a given. So number 1's a vaccine. Number 2 is that the virus burns out. Viruses get weaker over time. They get less efficient at what they do. There's seasonality in some viruses where the summer drives them away. So we don't know that the virus won't burn out. You don't count on it, but it's certainly a realistic possibility. Third way this will end is what I call default herd immunity, which means people that get the virus, not necessarily the illness, people that contract the virus, get infected, will become immune, even if they don't get symptoms, even if they don't get sick. But certainly if you do get sick and recover, the immunologists that understand the coronavirus think that there's a very high probability that there will be immunity if you survive the infection. And almost everybody will. So as we are talking, the hypothesis is that in New York City, as devastating as the toll is, there's rampant infection that is inapparent. It's inapparent because of people not being tested who don't have any symptoms. It's also inapparent because if you do have mild symptoms, you're basically advised to stay at home and you never go to a testing center. So there's a huge amount of immunity being built up in the community right now that we don't know. But the virus knows it, even if we don't. Which is, if the virus lands on somebody who is immune, they're not going to get infected. So just because we don't have the information doesn't mean that Darwin isn't at work. So we can have herd immunity, which is basically about half or so of the population becoming infected and immune that protects the other half. At a critical level, the virus doesn't propagate and it basically just dies because there's no transmission. So nobody knows what that number is. It's somewhere between 50 and 70%. So we can either get at that 50 or 70% passively, blindly, without knowing what's going on in a Darwinian world where virus just does its thing. And at some point, there will be default herd immunity. The problem is that that point may be very distant, and it's also going to be paradoxically much faster in places like New York, where it's running rampant, and much slower like in an island in Maine that thinks it's separate from the world and is kept basically wonderfully away from this dreaded beast as in a medieval walled town. But guess what? Next year, somebody's going to step off the ferry and infect someone, and they're going to have a late second wave, possibly a third wave, that's going to hit him after much of the rest of the world is immune. And it's just predictable. This is not, you know, a vague conjecture. This is what Darwin has in mind via the virus, no matter what these isolated communities think and do. And the fourth way of this coming to an end is proactive herd immunity, which is if and when society starts to realize that herd immunity is a good thing and stop scaring people out of their wits to avoid the virus, but have them be infected in some sort of controlled way so that those that get sick don't overwhelm hospitals. The answer is to tap the brakes for about the next year, get people infected, get them immune, keep tapping. It takes metrics. You have to have a dashboard to do that wisely. Some countries are way ahead of this game. They're recognizing this, they're gonna do it. The question is, are we gonna do it? Because it's one part science, one part art, and one part hugely important, transparent public communication. You need to get the public on board, because right now, everything I'm talking about is pretty counterintuitive, pretty threatening, pretty scary. So it has to be thought through, and it's a very, I don't mean to say it's a simple matter. It's in fact very complicated. So let me just wind up here. I'm finished, except for actually wanting to read to you the final paragraph of this op-ed. How are we going to spend the gift of time we bought through April's heroic suppression measures? This framework provides the guideposts for a decisive, nationwide, comprehensive, and cooperative action. This will bring out the best in our national character, resilience, and adaptability. Time is of the essence in moving forward on response plans based on the reality of virus behavior, not on aspirational cheerleading. Okay, let me stop there. I think that's been quite a heavy dose for everybody, and I apologize, but let me, I think questions have been coming in as I've been speaking, and maybe let me ask Daniela to forward some of them.
Yes, I want to pass along a couple of questions from Susan Strickler. Two questions. One is related to that there's an indication in South Korea that people who had infection and were quote unquote cured got it again. So immunity might not be so clear. If you could talk about that. And the other part of her questions are her son, not high risk factors, just a tendency to bronchitis, got very, very sick. And his doctors are seeing a lot of young adults hit very hard, not just those with pre-existing conditions. So if you could maybe address those 2 points, that would be wonderful.
Right, and they're both great questions, and they're both not without controversy. And I think controversy is good because it means, you know, the data are not in to give an unqualified, totally assured answer. And that's true, by the way, for almost any question we're going to have. But please realize the way science works and sifts through information is that the confidence goes through the second inning to the eighth inning and the ninth inning. It gets better and better. So, and also please recognize that I'm not a primary expert in any of this. What I do is I sift through a lot of information and I tend towards science and I tend toward primary science, as in like what goes on at the level of the literature or now in terms of case reports, because there's not even time to progress toward peer-reviewed literature. But to answer the question, I think most scientists that work in coronavirus immunology think that reinfection is unlikely. It's certainly possible, but that if it exists, it's a very small minority of people, if at all. You can never rule out everybody, but from the standpoint of public awareness and reassurance and what we need to understand in policymaking, I think there's good likelihood that people that are infected are going to be immune, meaning if they get re-challenged with the same virus, they will not become infected again. And nobody knows how long that immunity will last. Some think it could be short-term meaning several months or a year or two. And if we're lucky, it could be lifelong, but you need a lot more time to pass to figure that out. But I would discount reinfection as being a significant issue. And second, in terms of young adults, you know, there are exceptions to every rule. So I can't give anybody blanket assurances. But if you look at the numbers of illnesses by age group, it's stunningly different. Stunningly. Like from 0 to 15, there's almost no sickness in that age group. If your child is 0 to 15, it's sort of like being Clark Kent in the phone booth. I mean, it's the kids, those kids can be infected. I won't say that none will get sick, but especially those that have, you know, some significant, you know, like leukemia or immunosuppressed condition. I mean, that all bets are off. But if you have a normal kid, 0 to 15, they're bulletproof. If you're 15 to 50 and have no underlying conditions, you're in a very good space. Again, not to say that there's no prospect of winding up in the ICU or being on a ventilator, but please recognize that that pyramid base is so big that even if a tiny, relatively small percentage of them has an untoward event, that's gonna, with a big base of the pyramid, you're gonna get a lot of overloading of the medical care system. So everything we're doing now on suppression is reasonable. But just to give you one true fact that moved me yesterday and moved me to talk to you about it today, you know, I read a headline that says 48-year-old father of 6 is on the ventilator in an ICU. And so what does that do to the average person? You know, but scared the living daylights out of you. Is that not a true fact? Yes, it's a true fact. But the question is, out of 1,000 fathers of 6 at the age of 48, how many are going to wind up in the ICU on a ventilator? And the answer is very few. Doesn't remove the tragedy of it, but if you read the press and start putting together 100 of these every day, you know, you're not going to be a healthy camper.
Great. We have a couple of questions that are sort of related. Alex Sanger's question, shall we leave New York City assuming any place wants us, or should we hang in with the herd immunity? And Faith Catlin's question, what is your take on the states whose governors are asking New Yorkers to stay away? So the idea of New Yorkers staying and New Yorkers going away,
Right.
can you
Right.
sort of talk about all
Wow.
that?
Thank you for these. I love great New York questions, and I love New Yorkers. That's why it's my adoptive home. You guys are just terrific. So Alex Sanger, I mean, the issue, and I don't know this for sure, if you're vulnerable, it doesn't matter where you are. You actually should be where you are most comfortable, as long as you minimize human contact down to zero. They're a wonderful place. If you're in a place in New York City where you can, if you're vulnerable, if you can minimize human contact down to zero, you're not going to encounter the virus. So if you want to do that in New York City, and you can, that's great. If you want to do it, you know, by going to a remote corner of Greenland or chartering a private yacht, they're all the same. The key is fastidious quarantine. Avoid the virus, and the only way you're going to get exposed is via other people. If you're willing to take the draconian measures, that, by the way, I myself, just to be personal, I myself am doing, and you know, without regrets. That's what you need to do. So that's the Alex Sanger question. The not accepting New Yorkers, I won't look at it pejoratively as a personal affront. I will look at it as a totally unnecessary medieval enterprise or move that I refer people to Arthur Miller's The Crucible. If, to me, the reason Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible is to highlight our own fallen angels and the aspects of human nature that turn xenophobic in times of stress. And let me just say that there's a lot of that going on. I can understand it on the basis of human nature unleashing itself. It's natural. Many of us might even feel the same way. Let me just say, in a public health standpoint, it's uncalled for. And I think even presumably illegal, but that's something else to be tested. That's out of my domain.
We have a couple of questions also that are related. Ray Brunt's question, as far as exit strategies, how will we know if any burned out? And then Hillary Beck question, will this virus into some once we finally have a vaccine for coronavirus? Is there just another thing in the background to the void?
Okay, you were, I don't know for others, but you broke up for me a little bit, Daniela. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure, no problem. So Ray Brunt's question as strategies, how will we know with any certainty that the virus has burned out? And Hillary Beckton's question, will this virus die out or morph into something else through mutations? Is it helpful to discover the source? Once we finally have a vaccine for coronavirus, is there just another virus waiting in the background to fill the void?
Okay. So great questions again. Let me try to address each one frontally and quickly. How will we know if the virus has burnt out? It's very knowable if we have the right surveillance system in terms of the kinds of testing. There are two kinds of tests. One is genetic, one is antibody. We just need to get those tests validated, developed, and used in a widespread way. And we're gonna have, that's very doable, and it will be done. And so that answer is very positive. We are gonna know with the right dashboard whether it's burning out. And we will have that dashboard. The source, that's a really good question. So nobody knows the exact source, but the premise, I think, is pretty clear. And I wouldn't finger point China. I think that's another xenophobic notion. It could happen anywhere. But basically, smart viruses that are stressed for survival jump species. And they can jump species anywhere. They can jump species in Outer Mongolia or Idaho. So I would go easy on the Chinese, but it's a test that goes on every day in a million directions, and which brings to mind the third question, which is, are we sitting ducks for the next one? And the answer is yes. And so just, I would say just in the last 15 years, we've already had 3 or 4 of these that we've worked with and chosen to ignore. 2 of them were coronaviruses, SARS and MERS. One was more lethal. Actually, both were more lethal and less infectious. And so they just had different viral characteristics. And we were lucky with a relatively low toll. But this is the 3rd coronavirus in the last 15 years that has caused a major human upheaval. So what does that tell us? It means get prepared. And were we prepared this time? And I think you know the answer.
Right. So Stephen, maybe one last question before we wrap up, from your sister-in-law, Claire. Do you think Washington, D.C. is the next hotspot? Do you think in the spring might circumvent some cases in the D.C. area? Can you sort of talk about your thoughts about temperature?
Right. So let me say, if by the model I just laid out, and I want to reassure my sister-in-law, who's totally wonderful, and I'm not sure this is going to totally do it either. If you're a hotspot, you already know it, and if you're not a hotspot, you will be. It's very simple. In this whole equation of herd immunity and the way this is transmitted, every place either knows it's a hotspot or is a hotspot and doesn't know it, or thinks it's not a hotspot and will be. So that's what's on the equation. So Washington, D.C. is well on its way to being a hotspot. And you know why? Because it's just like every other metropolitan area that's getting testing. And as soon as you get broad enough testing, you get it to be a hotspot. So Claire, welcome to, as Alice, Alice Cooper said, welcome to my nightmare. You will be a hotspot, but not in a bad way, just like every other metropolitan location. And I already know there's a lot more coronavirus in the Washington area than anybody supposes. I would say 10 to 100-fold more. So, which is not a totally bad thing, because a whole bunch of people are getting it, not having any symptoms or having mild disease and becoming immune and helping themselves and actually the rest of the country eventually by being, citizens that can go out into society with good health and impunity.
So I want to take a moment to thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Kathy, for spending this time with us and all of you. I want to acknowledge Village Preservation for being such a wonderful partner of ours on this series. It is very powerful in a moment like this to come together, and also to come together with expertise and leaders. So to be able to have our way lit by really such a powerful actor as Kath, and such a really thoughtful epidemiologist as Stephen is really very restorative. And we intend to continue doing them every Tuesday at 3 p.m. and to share information and share community. And the structure of them is an artist in conversation with an expert of sorts. So our next week is Andrew Berman, who's the head of Village Preservation, talking about the impacts of epidemics on Manhattan, focused on the West Village, on Manhattan as a whole. We're focusing on incarceration and the impact of COVID-19 on those who are and have been incarcerated, and a number of sort of other topics. But this is incredibly beneficial to have time, really thoughtful time with all of you. And if you have any topics that you really want to discuss, we welcome you sharing them. If you have expertise that you would like to share with community, please let us know. This is a very organic thing that we're inventing together with you all. And we are really, really grateful to be able to share this with all of you. So I'm going to, unfortunately, we can't all hang out together on Zoom, but really like, so I'm going to sort of officially sign us off now and say with such gratitude, thank you for your time and your heart and your care, and stay safe and stay connected and stay brave. And we will see you hopefully next week. Okay.